Hillsong Church, the international religious group, was once best known for its celebrity attendees. But recently, Hillsong was rocked when one of its star pastors was fired and accused of multiple affairs.
For years, Hillsong looked unstoppable. The church built a global reputation with powerful worship music, packed arenas, and celebrity connections that made faith feel modern and exciting. To millions, it appeared to be the future of Christianity. But behind the polished image, serious problems were quietly growing. Scandals, hidden secrets, and leadership failures slowly began tearing the organization apart from the inside. How did one of the world's most influential churches fall so dramatically? And why has it never fully recovered? The scandal that started Hillsong's collapse. For years, Hillsong appeared untouchable. The church had become a worldwide phenomenon, attracting celebrities, selling out arenas, and building an image that felt more like a global brand than a traditional ministry. But in late 2020, something happened behind the scenes that would begin unraveling everything the church had worked decades to build. It started with a private message. On November 15, 2020, Brian Houston, Hillsong's founder and global leader, sent a short but serious text to Carl Lentz, the well-known pastor leading Hillsong New York. The message reportedly said only a few words: "We need to talk." At first, nobody outside the organization knew what was happening. But just 2 days later, the church made a shocking announcement that instantly exploded across headlines worldwide. Carl Lentz had been fired. Church leadership stated that the dismissal was connected to moral failures, but the statement raised more questions than answers. Carl was not an ordinary pastor quietly serving a local church. He had become one of the most recognizable faces in modern Christianity. With his designer outfits, celebrity friendships, and massive social media presence, he represented Hillsong's future in America. He was frequently seen alongside famous names like Justin Bieber and appeared more like a cultural influencer than a traditional spiritual leader. That was exactly why the scandal hit so hard. To outsiders, Carl embodied Hillsong's success story. Young people admired him. Media outlets praised Hillsong for making church look modern and relevant. But as more details surfaced, the polished image quickly began to crack. Carl later admitted to having an affair, but many former staff members claimed the problems inside Hillsong New York had existed long before the public confession. According to insiders, leadership concerns had been quietly building for years. Some staff described Carl as increasingly absent from his pastoral responsibilities. Instead of focusing on church leadership, critics said he spent more time traveling, attending celebrity gatherings, and maintaining his public image. Behind closed doors, frustration reportedly grew among team members who felt abandoned by leadership. Several believed the church had become too focused on influence and its status and visibility instead of accountability. And that became the real issue. Carl Lentz's downfall did not simply expose one man's mistakes. It forced people to question the culture surrounding Hillsong itself. Many began asking whether the church had created an environment where charisma mattered more than character. Had pastors slowly become celebrities protected by fame and influence? And if so, who was holding them accountable? The media frenzy intensified almost overnight. News outlets labeled Carl the celebrity pastor, while social media became flooded with debates about Hillsong's leadership and priorities. But beneath the headlines was something far more damaging than one public scandal. The situation exposed deeper concerns about the church's structure, transparency, and internal culture. For many longtime members, this was the first moment they realized something inside Hillsong might be seriously broken. And the deeper investigators looked, the darker the story became. Because Carl Lentz was not the root of the problem. He was only the first visible crack in a system that had been quietly developing for decades. What initially appeared to be a single scandal would soon lead directly back to the foundation of Hillsong itself and the man who built the empire from the ground up. To understand how everything spiraled so far out of control, we have to go back to where the story really began. A small church in suburban Australia that would eventually transform into one of the most influential religious brands in the world. The unexpected growth of Hillsong's influence. Long before Hillsong became a worldwide name, it began as something far more ordinary. In 1983, Brian Houston and his wife started a small congregation in the suburbs of Sydney, Australia. At the time, it wasn't anything extraordinary. The church had only a few dozen members, and it blended in quietly with other local ministries. But behind that humble beginning, something different was taking shape. Brian Houston wasn't just building a church, he was building an identity. From the very start, he understood something that many traditional churches overlooked. Connection mattered as much as message. While most congregations focused strictly on sermons and doctrine, Houston began shaping the church experience itself. He wanted something that would speak to younger generations who were slowly drifting away from traditional religious spaces. The turning point came years later, when Hillsong's worship music began gaining global attention. Songs like "Shout to the Lord," written by Darlene Zwickix in the early 1990s, spread far beyond Australia. Suddenly, churches in the United States, Europe, Africa, and Asia were singing the same songs. Without realizing it, Hillsong had built something powerful, an emotional bridge that connected people worldwide through music. That momentum changed everything. By 1999, the church rebranded itself simply as Hillsong. The name was shorter, sharper, and easier to remember. But more importantly, it signaled a shift from being just a local church to becoming a global identity. This wasn't accidental growth anymore. It was expansion with direction. Then came the transformation that set Hillsong apart from nearly every other church. Services were redesigned to feel like full-scale productions. Lighting systems, professional sound engineering, massive screens, and concert-style stages replaced the traditional church setting. Worship wasn't just something people attended, it became something they experienced. For many attendees, it felt more like stepping into a live event than a Sunday service. And it worked. Young people who had never felt comfortable in conventional churches suddenly found themselves drawn to Hillsong's energy and style. The atmosphere felt modern, welcoming, and culturally relevant. What started as a small church had now become a global network stretching across major cities like New York, London, Los Angeles, and beyond. But with growth came something unexpected. As Hillsong expanded, it wasn't just spreading worship, it was building a brand. A unified identity appeared across all campuses, from music style to visual presentation to leadership tone. No matter where someone attended, the experience felt almost identical. That consistency helped Hillsong grow rapidly, but it also began shaping a system where image became incredibly powerful. Then came the unexpected factor that pushed Hillsong into an entirely new level of global attention. Celebrities. Famous names began appearing in Hillsong services, and suddenly, the church was no longer just a religious movement. It was becoming a cultural trend. Paparazzi started showing up. Media outlets began paying attention, and Hillsong was no longer operating in the background of Christianity. It was now in the spotlight, and that spotlight would soon reveal something no one was fully prepared for. When fame enters faith, the rules begin to change, and not always for the better. The rise of the celebrity pastor era. As Hillsong's influence expanded, something subtle but powerful began to shift inside the church. It was no longer just about worship or community. It was becoming about visibility, image, and influence. And at the center of this transformation was a new kind of church leader, one who looked less like a traditional pastor and more like a public figure. Carl Lentz became the clearest symbol of this change. When he was sent to lead Hillsong's New York City campus in 2010, he quickly stood out. His style was modern. His presence was bold, and his approach felt completely different from what people expected from a pastor. Instead of quiet church halls, he preached in nightclubs before securing a permanent venue. Instead of staying behind the scenes, he was constantly in the public eye. and people were watching closely. His social media presence showed a life surrounded by celebrities, athletes, and influencers. Courtside basketball games, backstage concert access, and high-profile friendships became part of his everyday image. His connection with Justin Bieber only amplified his visibility, turning him into one of the most recognizable faces of Hillsong worldwide. To many followers, Carl represented something new, faith that felt modern, relatable, and culturally relevant. But behind that appeal, there were growing concerns that few people outside the organization fully understood. Inside the church, some staff members reportedly noticed inconsistencies. His schedule was often unpredictable, and his time seemed divided between ministry and high-profile social engagements. Over time, questions quietly surfaced about leadership focus and accountability. Who was actually guiding the congregation when attention was constantly elsewhere? That question became harder to ignore. The more Carl's fame grew, the more blurred the lines became between spiritual leadership and public celebrity. Instead of being evaluated by traditional pastoral standards, influence and popularity started becoming silent measures of success. Visibility began to matter more than stability. And beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Because when leadership becomes centered around image, accountability starts to weaken. And once accountability weakens, small issues don't stay small for long. They grow, unnoticed, until they eventually break through the surface. That breaking point was closer than anyone realized. What began as questions about one pastor's lifestyle would soon expand into something much bigger, pulling back the curtain on deeper issues within Hillsong's leadership structure and revealing problems that went far beyond one city, one leader, or one scandal. And once those deeper layers started to surface, the church's strongest foundations would begin to shake, the secrets that shook Hillsong's foundation. By this point, the questions surrounding Hillsong were no longer limited to one pastor or one city. The spotlight was beginning to shift upward, toward the very top of the organization. And what it uncovered would shake the church even more deeply than anyone expected. Brian Houston, the man who built Hillsong from a small suburban congregation into a global movement, was no longer just the founder being questioned. He was becoming part of the controversy himself. In 2021, internal investigations surfaced allegations involving Houston that sent shockwaves through the church. Reports claimed inappropriate behavior toward two women, including boundary-crossing messages and an incident involving a hotel room.
Brian Houston went into a woman's hotel room at the event, who was not his wife, Bobby.
At first, Hillsong leadership tried to contain the situation internally, issuing a temporary suspension and hoping the matter would stay out of public view. But secrets like this rarely stay hidden for long. By early 2022, details began leaking, and former staff members started speaking out. What was once an internal matter quickly turned into a global headline. Pressure mounted, and the situation became impossible to control. Eventually, Brian Houston stepped down from leadership after nearly 4 decades at the center of Hillsong's rise. His resignation marked a turning point, but the story didn't stop there. As investigations continued, a far older and more disturbing issue resurfaced, one tied not only to Brian Houston, but to his family history. His father, Frank Houston, who had served as a pastor decades earlier, had been accused of serious misconduct involving members of the church. Brian Houston had known about the allegations for years, yet chose to handle the matter internally rather than reporting it to authorities at the time. That decision would later come back with serious consequences. In 2021, legal charges were brought against Brian Houston for failing to properly report his father's actions. Suddenly, the leader who once represented modern Christianity on a global stage was facing criminal scrutiny. The image of transparency and moral authority that Hillsong projected was now being questioned at its core, and the ripple effects were immediate. Trust began breaking down across the global network. Some campuses started distancing themselves, while others shut down entirely. Former members began sharing stories of control, pressure, and hidden struggles they had never spoken about before. The organization that once felt unified was now fragmenting from within. And as more of these hidden layers came to light, one final question began to surface. Where was all the money going? And how deep did the system of power and secrecy really go? Because the next revelations would not just involve leadership failures, but something far more uncomfortable, something tied directly to how the entire empire sustained itself behind the scenes. The hidden cost of Hillsong's global success. As the scandals around leadership and secrecy continued to unfold, attention gradually shifted to another uncomfortable layer of the Hillsong story: money. For years, the church had projected an image of global success fueled by faith, worship, and generosity. But behind that polished image, questions were beginning to surface about how funds were actually being used. Hillsong was no small organization. With global campuses and massive attendance, it reportedly generated over $100 million annually. Yet despite the scale, financial transparency remained limited. Because of religious exemptions in many regions, detailed public oversight was minimal, and most donors had little visibility into how their contributions were distributed. For many members, giving was deeply personal. Tithes and donations were encouraged as acts of faith, often framed as spiritual investments with promised blessings. People gave with trust, believing their money was directly supporting ministry, outreach, and community work. But over time, that trust began to be tested. Leaks and internal reports painted a different picture. Former financial insiders and staff members described spending patterns that raised eyebrows. Travel expenses included first-class international flights, luxury hotels, and high-end accommodations. In some cases, single trips reportedly cost tens of thousands of dollars. Expenses that were labeled as ministry-related often blurred into personal comfort and lifestyle costs. Even more controversial were claims tied to leadership spending. Reports suggested that church credit cards were used for designer clothing, upscale dining, and other personal expenses, all justified internally as necessary for maintaining influence and public image. Critics later questioned whether image building had quietly become part of the financial system itself. Carl Lentz also became part of these financial concerns, with allegations that certain expenses for lifestyle and entertainment were covered under church accounts. Internally, some defended this as strategic positioning, arguing that connecting with influential circles required a certain standard of presentation. But for many outsiders, the contrast between leadership lifestyles and everyday donors became increasingly difficult to ignore. Because while leaders traveled in luxury, many members were sacrificing deeply, some even giving beyond their means, believing they were building something sacred and transparent. And then came the most troubling revelation of all: income streams that extended beyond church offerings. Hillsong's global music catalog generated millions through royalties and licensing, but not all of that revenue flowed directly into ministry work. Complex publishing structures meant that portions of income were controlled privately, raising further questions about where the money truly ended up. The more people looked into the financial structure, the more unclear it became. And just as trust in leadership had already been shaken, this financial uncertainty pushed the situation into an even more fragile state. Former members began demanding answers, while leadership responses often leaned on faith and trust rather than detailed disclosure. But by then, trust was already wearing thin. Because once financial transparency breaks down, it doesn't just raise questions about money, it raises questions about everything. And as those questions intensified, what remained of Hillsong's global image began to show signs of a deeper collapse, setting the stage for what would happen next: the widespread fallout that would reach far beyond the church itself. The final break in Hillsong's legacy. As the layers of scandals, leadership failures, and financial controversies came together, Hillsong entered a phase it could no longer control. What had once been a rapidly expanding global church suddenly began to fracture in real time. The damage was no longer isolated. It was spreading across continents. One by one, campuses began stepping away from the Hillsong name. Some shut down completely, while others quietly disaffiliated, choosing to operate independently. Major locations such as Dallas closed, while others in cities like Phoenix, Atlanta, and Kansas City distanced themselves from the brand entirely. What once looked like unstoppable global growth started reversing in silence and shock. But the biggest shift wasn't organizational, it was personal. For thousands of former members, Hillsong wasn't just a church. It was where they built friendships, found purpose, and shaped their beliefs. When everything began collapsing, many described the experience as losing more than a church. It felt like losing a part of their identity. The emotional impact ran deep, leaving confusion, disappointment, and in some cases, complete spiritual disconnection. Former attendees began speaking out publicly, sharing stories that had been kept quiet for years. Social media became filled with testimonies of control, pressure, and disillusionment. People who once celebrated Hillsong's music and message now questioned everything they had been taught. The same worship songs that once felt uplifting now carried a sense of emotional conflict for many who had left. Even within Christian communities, the ripple effects were undeniable. Churches that once admired Hillsong's growth began reassessing their own practices. Conversations about accountability, leadership culture, and financial transparency became more urgent than ever. The influence Hillsong once held was now being replaced by skepticism and caution. Yet, amid the collapse, there were also stories of rebuilding. Some former members found smaller communities where they felt more grounded and personally connected. Others stepped away entirely, trying to heal from experiences they were only beginning to fully understand. Former leaders and staff members also began sharing reflections, admitting how pressure, image, and rapid expansion had shaped decisions they now questioned. Still, the question lingered in the background. How did something so large fall so quickly? And why did it take so long for the cracks to become visible? Because by the time the world fully understood what had been happening inside Hillsong, the damage was already done. The image had shattered, the trust had broken, and what remained was no longer a unified movement, but a scattered legacy still trying to make sense of its own collapse. And in that silence after the storm, one truth stood out more than anything else. Even the most powerful empires built on belief can fall when the foundation beneath them begins to crack. Thanks for watching. If you found this story insightful, like and subscribe for more deep dives. Share your thoughts below and check out the next video.